I still remember clearly the sound of the glass door closing behind my back. It wasn't the ordinary click of an office door. It was the sound of a latch on a power that had just been pulled from my hands. The sound of a lock on a seat I had once believed I had earned with my entire youth. At the long walnut boardroom table on the 41st floor of Knight Industrial Group, familiar faces sat in 2 rows like a court with no judge. I had sat in the chair near the head of the table on the right side for 12 years, the place where I signed operational decisions, signed logistics contracts, signed painful rounds of cuts to keep the company alive. Today that chair was still there, but it was no longer for me. Andrew Knight stood up. He wore a dark blue suit tailored too perfectly to belong to someone who had ever walked through a factory. His eyes slid over me the way you look at a piece of furniture. Then he said, not loudly, not insultingly, just one short sentence, as if reading a line from the bylaws. This meeting is for family members only. I heard the word family like a thin blade, cold and clean, cutting through everything I had ever believed. I didn't react right away, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I had learned, since I was 19 standing in the packing area of the factory on the south side of Chicago, that an emotional reaction is what people use to throw you out of the game. I rose slowly, placed both hands on the table, and looked at the others. Rebecca Knight sat slightly bowed, her eyes fixed on some corner of the file, not looking at me, not looking at her brother. Elena Brooks, the CFO, sat on the opposite row, her throat moving as if she wanted to say something but swallowed it down. The board's attorney, Thomas Reed, had a stack of papers ready, a pen placed in exactly the right spot as if everything had been staged in advance. For a brief second I wanted to ask, 12 years doesn't count as family? But I didn't ask. I simply nodded, pulled my chair back, took half a step away, then turned. I walked straight to the door without looking back, because I knew looking back would only make me see that they felt no regret. The hallway outside the boardroom was wide and bright, glass walls facing the Chicago River. The skyscrapers reflected the gray, late autumn sunlight. I paused for a beat there, as if to make sure I was breathing. A young assistant stood a few meters away, holding an iPad, eyes wide. She had once called me Sir, with genuine respect. Today she didn't dare come closer. I didn't blame her. When power leaves, people automatically keep their distance, like avoiding a quarantined area. I stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, I looked at my reflection in the polished metal. I looked like a man who had just come from a funeral, but the real funeral was only beginning. The funeral of the role I had carried. My adoptive father, William Knight, had been buried 3 days ago. He built Knight Industrial from a small machine shop into a multi-industry conglomerate. He wasn't warm in the way of hugging or saying loving words. He was the old American type, believing in discipline, believing in work ethic, believing a late dinner was normal if the factory had problems. But he chose to adopt me. He brought me into his home, gave me the Knight name, gave me a chance to learn, work, and grow inside the very system he created. When I was 11, I stood in the living room of the big house in the northern suburbs of Chicago, holding my old backpack. William looked at me and said, "In this house, you earn your place." I understood. I lived by that sentence for 27 years. I wasn't a pampered child. I wasn't taken skiing in Aspen. I wasn't put into prestigious schools just for the label. I was taken to the factory. While kids my age played basketball, I learned how to read machine performance charts, how to talk to a shift lead, how to look at a production line and know where it would choke. I grew up with the smell of oil, the sound of conveyors, and the blunt words of workers who, if you were wrong, would say it to your face. I started working officially at the company when I was 19, beginning in logistics. I remember that winter, snow so thick that container trucks couldn't get in or out. A major delivery contract was threatened, and if we were late, the client would penalize us. I stayed all night, personally calling each carrier, finding alternate routes, negotiating with partners. The next morning, I went straight up to William's office and placed the plan on his desk. He didn't praise me. He just looked at me and nodded. For him, that nod was a crown. 12 years later, the family in Andrew's mouth took that crown off my head. The elevator reached the lobby. I stepped out, walked through the grand entrance where the bright metal Knight Industrial logo hung on the stone wall. I had stood here when the company signed the contract to expand the plant in Indiana. I had stood here when we cut 300 employees to avoid bankruptcy. I had stood here when the media came to interview the miraculous turnaround. Back then, they interviewed William and Andrew, while I stood behind the camera, keeping the ship from sinking. Now, I walked through the lobby like a visitor. Outside, it was cold. Wind from the river blew in, carrying the smell of water and metal. I stood on the steps in front of the building, watching traffic on Wacker Drive. I wondered, in that boardroom, they were reading the will. I had heard Thomas Reed say earlier, his voice flat as paper. Mr. Knight's estate and control shares will be allocated according to the trust. I understood the rest before they finished reading. In America's legal system, feelings aren't written into shares. In Delaware filings, there is no field for saved the company twice. In shareholder minutes, there is no line for carried the hardest decisions. There are only numbers, voting rights, and signatures. And I, the one without blood, could have a title, could have history, but lacked what they considered legitimate. Control. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A message from Elena. "Are you okay?" Just 4 words. I looked at it, then locked the screen without replying. Not because I was angry, but because if I replied right away, I would have to admit I was bleeding where no one could see. I walked down the steps toward the parking lot. Each footstep was like a slow drumbeat. I didn't know where I would go in the next few hours, but I knew one thing clearly. They took my chair. They thought that was the end. In truth, it was only the moment I was freed from the illusion that I could be loved through competence. I opened the car door, sat down and closed it. The space was quiet like a confessional. I placed both hands on the steering wheel and stared straight ahead. I thought of what William once said, "You earn your place." I had earned it, but they didn't acknowledge it. So I would choose another law, the one this America understands best. If you can't inherit power, you buy it. I started the engine. The car rolled out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, the Knight Industrial building receded, but the feeling of being cut out clung tight. I didn't promise myself revenge. I only said one sentence, so small only I could hear. They just gave me freedom, and they will regret doing that. I didn't go home right after leaving Knight Industrial's headquarters. I drove without direction, letting the city of Chicago pull me through familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. Signs I had passed every day now slid past my windshield like fragments of memories that no longer belonged to me. I knew that if I stopped too soon, I would have to face an emptiness I wasn't ready to name. Eventually, I pulled into a parking lot near the river. The sky had darkened. Streetlights reflected on the water in long, trembling streaks of yellow. I sat in the car for a long time, not turning on the radio, not checking my phone. The silence wasn't for rest. It was to hear my own thoughts clearly. I no longer had a title, at least not on paper. No internal email, no access to the ERP system, no more urgent calls from factories or warehouses. But there was one thing they couldn't take back: what I knew. And I knew this company in a way you only can when you've crawled all the way to its bottom. I thought about the numbers. They surfaced in my mind like reflexes. The logistics margin was being squeezed by a transport contract rushed through last quarter. The Western supply chain depended too heavily on a single supplier. A small change in fuel prices would be enough to collapse the entire quarter's plan. I knew Andrew couldn't see these things, not because he was stupid, but because he had never been responsible for the consequences. My phone buzzed again. Still Elena. This time it was a short email sent from her personal account, not the company system. She wrote that the executive board had just decided to temporarily revoke all my signing authority to stabilize the organization. The way they used words always amused me. Stabilize, in their language, meant removing whatever made them feel out of control. I didn't reply. I didn't need more information to understand what was happening. I had once been on the other side of decisions like that. I knew exactly when an organization begins justifying its own weakness. I drove back to my apartment in River North when it was fully dark. I bought this place with my own salary and bonuses, not as a family gift. When I closed the door and turned on the lights, the room lit up with a cold clarity. Everything was neat, precise, like the way I had always run the company. There were no family photos on the walls, only a few framed pictures of factories and warehouses, places where I had spent more time than in any living room. I took off my coat, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at my desk. Not because I had work to do, but because it was the only place that still gave me a sense of order. I opened my personal laptop. The internal systems were gone, but the market was still there. Public reports, Delaware filings, analyses any shareholder could read. I began reviewing them, unhurried, unstrained, like a doctor reading scans of a patient he had saved more than once. I immediately saw signs outsiders would miss: unusual expenses, investment decisions driven more by display than efficiency. Names on the shareholder list I knew well. Distant knights who had never set foot in a factory but were always ready to cash out when the market trembled. A thought formed clearly, without noise, without emotion. They didn't understand how this company breathed. And if you don't understand how it breathes, you won't know when it's about to choke. I remembered past meetings when I tried to explain risks, and Andrew brushed them off with slogans. We'll figure it out. The brand is strong. The market believes in us. The market doesn't believe in them. The market reacts to results, and results don't care about bloodlines. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. Not to rest, but to check whether I was still angry. I realized I wasn't. I didn't feel hurt like a victim. The clearest sensation was a cold lucidity, like standing before a difficult equation knowing it has a solution. If I couldn't return by title, I would return by something else. Something this system respects more than any last name: ownership. I knew Knight Industrial's share structure well. I knew who held how much. I knew who needed cash, who was afraid, who was waiting for an exit. They had taught me I wasn't family. Then I would act like an outsider who understood the game better than anyone inside. I opened a new file on my computer. No fancy title, just a list. Names, percentages, positions. I didn't call it a revenge plan. I called it a way back to the board by the rules they had chosen. When I shut the laptop, it was nearly midnight. The city outside was still lit. I stood up, stepped onto the balcony, and looked down at the traffic below. I knew that from this moment on, I was no longer the operator. But I also knew, with absolute clarity, that I was still the one who understood this company best. And in America, understanding, when paired with patience, always finds a way to become power. I flew to New York early in the morning, the first flight of the day, with no checked luggage. I didn't come as a former executive, nor as the sun pushed aside. I came as a harmless name on a passenger list, a middle-aged man in a dark coat, ordinary enough to be forgotten. This city never sleeps, but at that hour it has a rare moment of slowness. Taxis slid through misty streets. Glass buildings appeared like silent structures that know how to keep secrets. I liked New York for that. No one asks who you are. They only care what you are worth in that moment. My first meeting wasn't in a boardroom. It was in a small cafe near Midtown, where people speak loudly enough that no one hears clearly. The man across from me was a distant Knight relative, someone I had seen a few times at family ceremonies, close enough to greet, not close enough to remember the name. He arrived 10 minutes late, sweat on his forehead, eyes checking his watch repeatedly. On the table, he placed his phone face down, as if afraid a message might expose what he was about to do. He talked a lot about the market, about interest rates squeezing cash flow, about personal investments that were no longer paying off. I listened without interrupting. When he stopped, I asked only one question, light and slow. Do you plan to hold that stake for long? He looked at me, slightly surprised, then smiled, a defensive smile. He said the shares were a family legacy, that he believed in the new management. I nodded, as if agreeing. I didn't argue. I simply said I was looking for a long-term investment opportunity and was willing to buy at a reasonable price, quietly, without noise. I said it the way one talks about the weather. The meeting ended faster than I expected. There was no handshake of promise, just one sentence. Let me think about it. I stood up first, paid, and left. I knew the seed had been planted. Once people think about selling, they rarely return to innocence. The days that followed passed in a repeating rhythm. Another cafe, a small law office in Delaware, a rushed lunch. I didn't accumulate shares like a greedy man. I accumulated them like someone who understands structure. Small blocks, percentages too insignificant to attract attention. No one sounds an alarm when a piece is taken. Only when the picture starts missing do people panic. I worked through intermediary lawyers, people who know how to stay silent and legal. Clean paperwork, transparent money flow, nothing that could be called a hostile takeover. On record, I was just a patient individual investor. In reality, I was redrawing the power map of the very company I once ran. At times, I looked at the shareholder list and laughed quietly. Names that once sat across from me in board meetings, that once spoke of family values, now sold piece by piece for very human reasons. Tuition for children, a loan coming due, a personal project that failed. No one sold because they hated the company. They sold because they needed to. The market doesn't judge. The market only trades. At night, I returned to the hotel, opened my laptop, and updated the numbers. 5.2%, 8.9%, 12.4%. The rising figures didn't excite me. They sharpened my focus. Every percentage was a voice. Every voice was a vote. And a vote, in this system, speaks louder than any family photo on a wall. One evening, Elena called me. Her voice was low, cautious. She asked if I was in New York. I neither confirmed nor denied. She said the management was struggling to pass a major decision. Not enough consensus, not enough confidence. I listened, then said I was no longer in a position to intervene. She was silent for a moment, then said, "I wish you were here." I didn't respond to that. I knew rumors were beginning to spread. Some minor shareholders asked lawyers why shares were being quietly inquired about. Management started to notice, but not enough to understand. They looked at the charts, saw no major movement, and reassured themselves. They didn't understand that power rarely arrives in leaps. It arrives in small, steady, silent steps. When I reached 17.8%, I stopped. Not because I couldn't buy more, but because I didn't need to. That number was enough to block, enough to demand, enough to force others to listen. I closed the laptop and looked out the hotel window. New York at night glowed like a circuit that never shuts off. I thought about Andrew, about the boardroom in Chicago, about the empty chair on the right side of the table. They sold me pieces of the company, not because they hated me, but because they never imagined I would become something dangerous. They thought I was just the one pushed out. They were wrong. I sent a short email to my lawyer. Prepare the major shareholder notification. No explanation, no threat, just the exercise of a legal right. I turned off the lights and lay down, and for the first time in weeks, I slept without dreaming of factories. The next morning, as the city woke up, I woke with it. No longer the man standing outside looking in, but the man holding a stake large enough to change direction. I didn't call it revenge. I called it a return in the language they understood best. The email calling the special shareholders meeting arrived near noon. The subject line was short, cold, the kind of legal language Knight Industrial always used when it wanted to control the situation. Special Shareholders Meeting, New York. I read it twice, not to understand the content, but to feel the timing. They don't call meetings when things are stable. They only do it when sleep starts to slip away. I arrived in New York a day early, this time no longer hiding as a harmless name. I walked into the hotel where the meeting would be held, the lobby lights reflecting off marble like a stage preparing to open. I recognized a few familiar faces in the elevator. Lawyers, financial advisors, people who had passed by me in meetings before without bothering to remember my name. They looked at me longer than usual, their expressions mixed with curiosity and suspicion, as if they sensed something was no longer on its expected path. The next morning, the meeting room was set on a high floor, glass walls all around, looking straight down at the city. A symbolic choice the organizers always favored. High, bright, and designed to make everyone feel above others. I arrived on time. Not early enough to draw attention, not late enough to be seen as defiant. I chose a seat in the second row, close enough to hear clearly, far enough to observe. Andrew was already there. He stood talking with several executives, smiling just enough, nodding at the right rhythm. When he saw me, his smile slowed for a very brief moment. Too brief for outsiders to notice. Long enough for me to know he hadn't expected this. We didn't greet each other. There was no need. The meeting opened with familiar phrases: market conditions, stability, shareholder confidence. I listened as one listens to an old song. When it came time to announce the updated list of major shareholders, Thomas Reed stood up. He adjusted his glasses, opened his folder, his voice steady. Names were read out. Percentages passed by like lifeless numbers. Then he read my name. Jordan Knight, 17.8%. The room didn't erupt. It fell silent in the way only places of power can fall silent. I felt the shift immediately, like a sudden change in air pressure. A few people turned to look at me. Elena turned around, her eyes widening, unable to hide her shock. Andrew stood still, his back stiffening slightly. He didn't turn right away. He needed a few seconds to be sure he hadn't misheard. "Since when?" Andrew asked, his voice trying to stay controlled. I looked straight ahead, didn't stand up, didn't smile. "Since the moment I was told I wasn't family," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't whisper either. Just enough for the room to hear. Thomas Reed continued the presentation as if this were just another procedural detail. But no one was listening anymore. Every gaze had shifted toward me, not with anger, but with a shared question. What is he doing here? When it came time to vote on the senior management restructuring plan, I raised my hand. A simple gesture, but it triggered a chain reaction I had calculated. With my shareholding, the plan didn't have enough votes to pass. Thomas Reed paused, checked the numbers again, then announced the result. The plan was deferred. Andrew turned to me again. This time, there was no concealment. "You can't just show up and block everything," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm not blocking everything," I replied. "I'm only blocking what will make the company bleed." A few executives lowered their eyes to their documents. I knew they understood. They had heard me say these things before, when I still sat in the chair on the right side of the table. Back then, it was ignored. Now it was heard again because it came with voting power. The meeting dragged on for another 2 hours, but the center had shifted. It was no longer Andrew speaking and everyone nodding. Every proposal now had to pass through me, not because I wanted control, but because the power structure had changed. I didn't attack. I didn't accuse. I only asked questions. And questions, when placed correctly, always expose gaps. When the meeting ended, no one applauded. No one congratulated anyone. People left the room in heavy silence. Andrew walked out quickly without looking back. Elena paused by me for a brief moment and said quietly, "They didn't see this coming." I nodded. I didn't feel the need to say more. I stayed in the room until last. Staff folded chairs and gathered documents. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the glass, casting angled bands of light across the long table. I stood there for a moment, looking at the empty chair on the right side near the head. The chair I had once been asked to leave. I didn't sit down, not yet. I only placed my hand on the back of the chair, feeling the cold surface of the leather. I didn't need them to acknowledge me as family. I only needed them to acknowledge one thing they could no longer deny. I owned the decision. When I left the room, I knew everything had shifted direction. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a slow pivot, impossible to reverse. The first board meeting after the shareholders' meeting happened sooner than I expected. Not because anyone was impatient, but because they no longer had a choice other than to sit in the same room with me. This time, the invitation didn't mention family. It mentioned voting rights, ownership percentages, and the importance of strategic alignment. The meeting room in New York was smaller than the one in Chicago, but tighter, with less light. I entered last, not to make an impression, but because I knew the eyes would follow on their own. Andrew was already seated in the central position, a thick stack of documents in front of him, the company logo printed on the cover. When I sat down, no one spoke. The silence stretched just long enough for everyone in the room to adjust their mental footing. Andrew opened with his familiar executive tone, speaking about stability, continuity, and market confidence. I listened, taking very few notes. Not because I didn't care, but because I had heard these arguments too many times, from my own mouth, back when I was responsible for defending imperfect decisions. When he finished, the gaze in the room shifted toward me like an unspoken request. I didn't rush. I turned a page in the folder in front of me, then set my pen down. "I have just one question," I said. "Can anyone in this room explain why the logistics margin has declined for 3 consecutive quarters, while fuel costs haven't risen proportionally?" No one answered right away. One executive glanced at the person beside him, another adjusted his tie. Andrew said the market was difficult, that it was a general trend. I nodded, then followed up. "Then why is our direct competitor maintaining stable margins?" It wasn't a difficult question, but it required the person answering to know what they were talking about. I wasn't asking to undermine anyone. I was asking to force the truth into the room. The meeting began to shift its rhythm. General statements were replaced by numbers. Projects once approved for their long-term vision now had to face specific cost tables. I didn't object emotionally. I simply asked for explanations. And when there were none, I asked for a pause. Andrew started to lose patience. I could see it in the way he tapped his pen on the table, in the shortening of his breath. "You're acting like you run this company," he said, half joking, half warning. "I don't run the company," I replied. "I just don't allow it to hurt itself." Elena looked up at me. In her eyes, I didn't see personal loyalty, but the relief of someone finally hearing what she had been thinking but hadn't dared to say. A few others began asking questions in the same vein. Not against Andrew, just no longer in blind agreement. Midway through the meeting, Thomas Reed proposed forming a strategic oversight committee to enhance transparency. I knew it was the legal way to name a power shift no one wanted to acknowledge. I agreed, with one condition. The committee would have the authority to review all current operational contracts, without exception. Andrew objected. Not forcefully, just enough to show his displeasure. But when it came to a vote, the majority approved. Not because they trusted me, but because they were no longer certain they could trust him as before. When the meeting ended, I didn't stay to speak privately with anyone. I gathered my papers, stood up, and left the room. I didn't need to reinforce an image. The outcome had already done that for me. That evening, I walked alone through the city. New York at night doesn't ask what you're thinking. It just keeps moving. I stopped at a street corner, watching the flow of people, and realized something with clarity. I no longer felt pushed out. I didn't feel victorious either. I felt responsibility returning, heavy and unmistakable. I knew that from this point on, every decision I blocked, every project I questioned, would be viewed through a different lens. They would call me controlling, someone unable to let go of the past. I accepted that. I had lived long enough inside this system to know that labels matter less than results. When I returned to the hotel, I opened my laptop and reviewed the preliminary meeting minutes. My name appeared where it hadn't before, not as a title, but as a pivot. I closed the machine, leaned back in my chair, and for the first time since leaving Chicago, I allowed my breathing to slow. They didn't give me power today. They merely acknowledged a truth that had existed for a long time. And that acknowledgement, however reluctant, was enough to set everything moving in a different direction. I didn't fire anyone in the first week. That made people more uncomfortable than being named outright. In an organization accustomed to fast decisions and neat explanations, prolonged silence is a kind of pressure no one is prepared to endure. I knew that. I had used it before, long before I was pushed out. Rumors spread faster than official announcements. Hotel corridors, small meeting rooms, phone calls that lasted longer than necessary. People whispered that I was making a list, that I was going to clean house. I didn't confirm. I didn't deny it either. I let them fill the empty space with their own fear. The Strategic Oversight Committee began its work in a room without windows. I requested all operational contracts from the past 3 years. Thick folders were carried in and placed on the table like weights. I didn't read to find faults. I read to understand habits. An organization doesn't collapse because of one bad decision. It collapses because many temporary decisions are accepted as normal. I saw familiar names. Appointments made because of relationships. Projects approved because no one wanted to say no. Costs pushed to the next quarter to make reports look better. I marked very little. Not because there were few problems, but because I only needed a few precise points for everything else to reveal itself. Andrew appeared less often in the working sessions. When he did, he spoke more than usual, explaining, defending, emphasizing vision. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I only asked, who bears final responsibility if this doesn't work? That question often fell into empty space, because collective responsibility is the fastest way for no one to be responsible. One afternoon, Elena brought me an internal report that only I used to request. She set it on the table without a word. I read it, then looked up at her. How long have you known about this? I asked. She replied, long enough to know no one wanted to hear it. I nodded. I didn't say thank you. She didn't need it. Recognition at this point came from problems being addressed, not from words. Those who had relied on the Knight name began to show unease. They sent longer emails. They emphasized past achievements. They spoke of loyalty. I read them all. I didn't respond immediately. Loyalty to whom is a different question from loyalty to what. I cared only about the second. That weekend, Andrew requested a private meeting. No lawyers, no advisors, just two people who had grown up under the same roof. We sat in a small meeting room, white lights, empty table. He said I was harming team morale, that my presence made people afraid. I listened until he finished, then said, fear doesn't come from me. It comes from results starting to be measured. He said I was trying to prove something. I shook my head. I'm not proving, I'm fixing. That difference held him silent for a few seconds. I didn't use that pause. I didn't need to win a private argument to win a larger game. After the meeting, I didn't change how I worked. I still didn't fire anyone. I still asked for data. I still asked questions. And little by little, the old structure began to crack on its own. One director resigned. One project was delayed. One expense was cut. There were no press releases, no strong statements, just the quiet shifting of parts that could no longer hold. I noticed something interesting. The competent people weren't afraid of me. They sought me out. They came with specific questions, clear proposals. They didn't talk about family, they talked about efficiency. And I listened to them, the way I had listened to factory workers many years ago. A system always has people keeping it alive, even if their names never appear on the board. By the end of the third week, the interim financial report showed small but real numbers. Costs under control. Clearer cash flow. Not a miracle, just discipline returning. I looked at those numbers and didn't feel proud. I simply felt calm, the way someone feels knowing a ship has stopped drifting. That night I stood alone in the room, looking at the city through the glass. I thought about the feeling of being cut out, about the anger I had chosen not to keep. I understood that if I acted from emotion, I would destroy the very thing I wanted to protect. Revenge, if it existed at all, only mattered if it didn't harm the core. I knew I was becoming an uncomfortable name. A resistance. Someone not easy to control. I accepted that role. Because sometimes, the only thing an organization needs is someone willing to stand still while everything else is sliding away. Andrew asked to see me late one evening after most of the office lights had gone out. There was no formal appointment, no email, just a short message. We need to talk. I knew this wasn't a conversation about strategy. This was the conversation of someone who could feel the ground beneath his feet was no longer as solid as before. We met in a small conference room tucked away at the end of the corridor. The room was rarely used, lit by pale yellow lights, an empty wooden table. No logo, no presentation screen, just two chairs facing each other. Neutral enough that neither side had an advantage. Andrew arrived first. He stood with his back to the window, looking down at the street. When I walked in, he turned around, his eyes more tired than I remembered. Not tired from work, but tired from holding together an image that was cracking. He said directly that things were getting out of control, that the executive team was divided, that shareholders were starting to ask questions, that I was becoming the center of everything. I didn't deny it. I didn't claim credit either. I simply sat down and let him speak until he was finished. When he stopped, the room fell silent. I let that silence stretch a few more seconds. Not to apply pressure, but to be sure we were speaking without our usual layers of defense. Andrew said he wanted to reset everything. He used words like reconciliation, shared power, appearing together in front of the media. I heard those words clearly. They weren't an apology. They were an attempt to preserve what remained. I looked at him and realized that for the first time since our father died, he wasn't speaking from the position of an heir. He was speaking with the voice of someone afraid of losing everything. "I'm not here to punish you," I said. My voice was calm enough to surprise even me. "I'm here to keep the company from collapsing." Andrew reacted immediately. He said I was putting myself above him, that I was using shares to force him. I shook my head. I'm using shares to force the truth to be faced. I didn't bring up the past. I didn't talk about the day I was asked to leave the boardroom. I didn't need to. Those things had already served their purpose. He asked me what I wanted. The question hung between us, heavier than any accusation. I thought for a few seconds. Not because I hadn't considered it before, but because I wanted to be sure my answer didn't come from emotion. "I want this company to be run by people who can bear responsibility," I said. "And I want you to step away from the executive role." Andrew jumped to his feet. The chair scraped hard against the floor. He said I had no right to decide his future. I looked straight into his eyes. "You're right," I said. "I don't decide your future. I decide the company's." We stood facing each other for a few seconds. Neither of us spoke. In his eyes, I saw something I had never seen before. Belated understanding. Not understanding me, but understanding that there are things you can't hold on to with a last name or a will. Finally, he sat back down. His voice was lower. He asked if there was another way. I said there was. He could keep his shares, keep the family's honor, but not the executive authority. That wasn't humiliation. It was a boundary necessary for the company to survive. Andrew didn't answer right away. He stared down at the table, where there was nothing to look at. I didn't rush him. A decision like that doesn't need speed, it needs acceptance. At last, he nodded very slightly, not a sign of full agreement, but a sign that there was no better option left. We left the conference room without shaking hands. There was no need. Everything that needed to be said had been said. When I stepped into the hallway, I realized I didn't feel triumphant. There was no sense of victory, only a cold clarity, like cutting away dead tissue to save the body. That night, I sat alone in my hotel room, not turning on the main lights. The city's glow was enough to see everything. I thought about the thin line between revenge and responsibility. I had gone far enough to know that real revenge isn't about hurting others. It's about proving they were never essential. I didn't need Andrew to fall. I only needed the company to stand. And if that meant he had to step aside, then it wasn't cruelty. It was the right choice. The decision to appoint me as interim CEO was approved on a quiet morning, with no media, no press release. Just a line in the board meeting minutes, read in an even voice, as if it were something obvious that had been delayed too long. I sat there, listening to my name being called in a role I had long performed in practice, but had never been acknowledged on paper. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel relieved either. The only sensation was the return of a familiar weight, like putting on a coat you've worn for years, heavy, but fitting. I knew that from this moment on, decisions would no longer hide behind debate or divided votes. Responsibility, this time, bore my name. On my first day back at the Chicago headquarters as CEO, there was no welcoming ceremony, no line of people waiting. I walked through the main lobby, where the Knight Industrial logo still hung on the stone wall, and realized nothing physical had changed. What had changed was the way people looked at me. Not with curiosity, but with the scrutiny of those who wanted to know whether I would be like the ones before. I went straight up to the 41st floor. The large boardroom was still there. The long wooden table, the leather chairs, light pouring through the glass. I paused at the doorway for a few seconds, not out of hesitation, but because I remembered clearly the day I was asked to leave this room. I walked in, went to the chair on the right side near the head of the table, and pulled it out. This time, no one said anything. The first meeting under my authority was shorter than anyone expected. I didn't talk about grand visions. I didn't mention family. I talked about specifics. Who was responsible for what, where the deadlines were, and what would happen if targets weren't met. Not threats, just clarity. I looked at each person in the room and said I didn't need their loyalty to me. I needed their loyalty to results. The weeks that followed had no dramatic moments, no public reversals, no sensational headlines, just work getting done. Some people left. Some were retained. Some were given a voice for the first time. Culture doesn't change overnight, but it began to shift, little by little, toward a place where competence carried more weight than a last name. Andrew kept his word. He stepped away from executive duties and didn't appear in routine meetings. His shares remained. His name stayed on the list of the founding family. We didn't speak privately anymore. There was no need. Our relationship had been placed in its proper frame. History, not power. One afternoon, I stood alone in the boardroom after hours. The city outside was beginning to light up. I looked down at the traffic below and thought about the path that had brought me here. From a child standing in a living room with an old backpack, to a man pushed aside for not sharing blood, then returning by a route no one had anticipated. I understood very clearly that I would always be called the adopted one. That label wouldn't disappear. But I also understood that, in the end, it no longer defined me. What defined me was that this company still stood, still functioned, and no longer hurt itself through decisions based on privilege. I didn't try to erase the past. I didn't rewrite it either. I simply put it in its proper place. Those who believed power came from blood had their chance. Now this company was guided by a simpler principle. Colder, but fairer. Understanding and responsibility. When I left headquarters that evening, no one walked me to the door. I liked that. Real power doesn't need ceremony. It needs effectiveness. I sat in the car and looked back at the building one last time that day. There was no sense of being cut out. No lingering anger. Only a steady stillness, like knowing you're standing exactly where you belong. They once said I wasn't family. They were right. Family is something you're given. What I have, I built myself, through understanding, through patience, and through refusing to leave the company, even when it left me. And that is why I'm sitting here now. Not because I carry the Knight name, but because I understand this company better than anyone who has ever sat in that chair.